Afternoon. Good afternoon, and welcome to Rock Valley College's first Tuesday lecture series for spring of 2024. My name is Dr. Blanchard, and I am the Executive Director for Center for Instructional Design, Teaching, and Innovation. And I have the privilege of introducing our keynote speaker for the day, Professor Brian Wagner. Got a few. So you're clapping because you already know him and how amazing he is. I actually wrote down a few notes because I didn't want to miss a few things. Professor Wagner earned both his bachelor's and master's degree from Northern Illinois University and has been a professor at Rock Valley College since 2010. This is his 13th lecture in the first Tuesday lecture series. Lucky 13 for all of us. But in the past, he has shared on topics such as postmodernism and ethics, history of Islamic religious interpretations, and 911 conspiracies. He has served at Rock Valley as the president of the Faculty Association, and some of you may know him as advisor for the Philosophy Club as well. Today, he joins us to talk about cults, how to detect cults, what types they are, their characteristics, reasons why people get caught up in them, and how to avoid them. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Brian Wagner.
Started. There you go, now you can hear me. So my definition for a cult is simply a group that practices manipulation or thought control using misguided or coercive means toward the potential for harm. Meaning that a cult is not just something you disagree with, it has certain objective criteria that you can use to analyze and determine what makes something a cult. Now, some people are not comfortable with using the word cult for this type of definition because they say that some religions start off as a cult because they're unpopular. So if that helps to satisfy you, then let's just call this dangerous cults, right? There's a lot of new terminology now that's coming out saying that we're talking about dangerous cults as opposed to, say, ordinary cults like a sorority or a fraternity or something like that. When we talk about cults in my class, we're talking about this dangerous type of cult that has the potential to harm people. There are different types of cults, of course. There are religious cults and secular cults. There are MLM or multi-level marketing schemes. There are political cults. And we can talk about all of them in this. This isn't specifically about religion, but as you probably know, since I teach world religions, I've been studying religious cults the most. But I'm starting to also see the parallels between the religious cults and the secular cults and noticing that they have certain qualities in mind. Now, given that there are cults that do exist, how do we know what's true and what's false? This is what the project of philosophy is all about. And I think the answer is pretty obvious. We know what's true and false through evidence and good reasoning. Religions sometimes struggle with this because a lot of religions don't have evidence to be able to back up some of their claims. After all, how do you prove or disprove certain claims to be true? How do you know if reincarnation is real or not real? What evidence would you use to try to prove that? How do you know who goes to heaven and who goes to hell? What evidence would you use to prove that? So religions oftentimes fall into this problematic area of trying to determine what's true if we're using just mere evidence. But good reasoning, I think, of course, can accompany that, and religions can deal with that as well. So in philosophy, what we tend to do is to search for truth using logic and reasoning to try to understand what makes something true or false, or understand what makes something right or wrong. This is a process of asking questions, searching for answers, And it does have a healthy dose of skepticism. Not that skepticism is always good. It's good when it's searching for the truth. It's bad if you're just simply using skepticism as a means to say, question things without regard to the truth, right? Just questioning for the sake of questioning, I don't think is a good thing. So when I say skepticism in this sense, I mean that I'm asking questions to try to find out what the truth is so we can search for those answers and hopefully the truth will reveal itself. Now, the problem is that we oftentimes don't accept the truth when we first hear it. Voltaire was a famous philosopher who famously said that when people are first confronted with the truth, first they laugh at it, then they get angry with it, and then they accept it. And I think there is some truth to that, that Voltaire has been known for capturing what people do when they respond to a new theory of science or a new philosophy or whatever. And so sometimes we just have to recognize that when we first hear the truth, it may seem funny to us, and then we may get very angry at it, but later on we may accept it. We tend to believe things that coincide with our current beliefs. That is, when we're operating, just functioning through society, we oftentimes accept beliefs that we already have, and we reject beliefs that contradict our current beliefs. In fact, we tend to look for evidence that fits our current beliefs, and we tend to ignore evidence that contradicts our beliefs. This is known as confirmation bias, and we are all prone to that. So what we have to do is to understand where our biases lie and to try to search for the truth using the evidence and good reasoning. David Hume once said that a wise man proportions his beliefs to the evidence, and I think that's a good rule to kind of live by, to kind of see where the evidence points, and we can kind of see what's true or false through that. Now, when I was studying cults, as many of you have probably seen, if you've already taken my world religions class, there are a variety of different characteristics that cults or people who study cults will appeal to. And I've made a list of these in previous classes. I usually give the truncated version in my world religions class, but the complete list is on the board. And the thing that's always frustrated me is the question, do you have to have all of these characteristics to be a cult? And the answer is obviously no. I noticed that there were certain characteristics that were necessary for having a cult. And that's what caused me to write this lecture, is that I started to worry about what are the things that make something a cult, the other things being sort of like side qualities that maybe are not as necessary. So I whittled down this list to just 4 that I think are the necessary conditions for what it is to be a cult. And these are the 4 that I want to highlight today in this lecture. Now, the first quality is blind faith. Cults tend to start with blind faith because they're usually presenting something that's either based on no evidence or shoddy reasoning at best, right? I mean, think about it. If it were good reasoning, then it would be a good religion, right? You know, good religions have good reasons for why they believe it. They might even back it up with evidence or good logic, good reasoning. But when somebody starts preaching something that's really absurd, something that we would tend to regard as false, they usually don't have good reasons for it, or they may not have any reasons, and they may ask you to just simply accept it on what's called blind faith. Now, that is the favorite calling cry of a cult, and cult leaders love that because if they can get you to believe something without any evidence, then they can lead you down any road, and that's where the cult begins. So it usually starts with blind faith. But obviously, if you're practicing a good religion, you don't need to have blind faith because you can actually support it with reasons. And I would say the same thing about science and philosophy as well, right? That if you're just simply presenting ideas and a philosophy without any reasoning or any evidence, a good philosophy is going to be backed up with evidence. It's going to be backed up with good reasoning. The second quality is an us versus them mentality, where people begin to divide people into 2 categories, saying that you're either with us or you're with them, and the us group is good and the them group is bad. And this dichotomy sort of sets the stage for a heroes and villains kind of scenario, where the cult wants to say, you have to be in our circle to be good. Anyone who's outside of our circle is bad. And cults almost always have that property. This is what I'm talking about. I'm saying they always have this property for reasons I'm about to give. And that's why I think that a lot of people don't think that they start off as a cult. the reasons why they don't think that they're in a cult is because they think, well, I'm just simply choosing the good guys. And, any group can do that, right? Philosophers can do that. Scientists can do that. Political groups can do that. You might say that there are some bad guys that exist out there. The question is, does it have these other characteristics as well? And as I'm trying to point out, you have to have all four of these to be a dangerous cult. The third quality is what, for lack of a better word, I'm just going to call is the slow walk. And this is one that I have not ever put on my list before, because the slow walk, I think, can be used in non-cult venues like education. A slow walk is simply when you move a person inch by inch toward a new belief or a behavior. So, when you're educating people, you might give them information that's sort of bite-sized, something that they can sort of handle on the forefront. But then as you start getting into the complexities of it, like in science, to understand a complex concept, you may have to sort of inch them toward that by giving them the parts first and then working through the details later on. So I never really considered the slow walk fallacy as a bad thing prior to this, but I'm starting to notice that it's actually one of the key ingredients of a cult, because I think what the cult starts to do is to get you to trust them with something simple, right? They give you a belief that they say you can probably accept. And then once you accept that belief, they introduce another belief. And if you're willing to accept that, they keep inching you closer and closer to something that ultimately ends up being dangerous or false or absurd. And that's what the slow walk fallacy does, is trying to stay below your threshold of skepticism as an attempt to gain your trust and to increase your buy-in for the cult teachings. So they're trying to get you to accept these teachings little by little. They don't start with the aliens, right? They don't start with the suicide pact. They don't start with the terrorism. They begin inch by inch with stuff you already believe, and then they work your way up to those beliefs. And that slow walk is sometimes called the foot in the door fallacy. This is what Rick Alan Ross says in his book on cults. The foot in the door is saying, if I can get my foot into your door, then you can't close the door on me, because I've already got your attention. Like someone who's trying to close the door on a used car salesman, or I don't know what example that would be, but that you got the foot in the door, and as long as you can keep that door open, then the person's still listening to you. Maybe they'll eventually open the door and keep walking with you down that road. A good example of the slow walk fallacy, I think, are horror movies. Horror movies don't start with, the climax of the movie, whatever it is. So if I told you that small Asian women could crawl out of your television set, you'd probably all look at me like I'm absurd. But if I show you a movie that kind of leads you to a small Asian woman crawling out of a television set, then you'd be like, oh my gosh, that's so scary, right? And if you haven't seen The Ring, you don't know what I'm talking about, right? But horror movies build on this, right? They start with something, it's just ordinary people having their life, and then something questionable happens, a noise, or maybe they saw something out of the corner of their eye, and then it starts to build, and then they say, oh, well, this used to be an ancient burial ground, or there used to be people who lived here, but they died. And then you start questioning things. You're like, well, wait a minute, maybe there are ghosts, and maybe that those signs that we were hearing, those noises, lead to something else. And then they get you to the final destination where they're saying, right, here is the tree witch, or whatever it is from Blair Witch Project. So horror movies play on that slow walk fallacy, so you can see how this operates. The movie is trying to take you to a place where you will accept something that they are trying to get you to believe in. And of course, I think cults fit that as well. But so does education, so does science, so does philosophy. That is, when we're trying to get people to understand concepts, sometimes we have to walk people toward that. You don't start with calculus, you start with arithmetic. Then you go to geometry, then you go to trig, then you go to calculus. So there is a building effect, and that's why I was always hesitant to include the slow walk fallacy as a part of cults, because I thought this is how education works, right? When I'm trying to figure out how to teach, I'm oftentimes thinking in this way, like, what do I need to say to students to get them to understand this concept that we're about to introduce? So the slow walk fallacy isn't always a fallacy, it's just a method for teaching, but it becomes a fallacy in cults when it's used to lead to number 4. And that fourth quality is a ends justify the means mentality. Now, if any of you have ever taken an ethics class, you know what I'm talking about. For those of you who haven't, understand that ends justifies the means that you are using people as an instrument for your own devices. That is, you don't care about the person, You're not treating them with respect. The moment that you start treating people as a means to an end, the moment that you stop respecting people as an end in and of themselves, when you start calculating how you can exploit people for personal gain, you lose the moral high ground. And cults are notorious for that. So when I say a cult is something that's going to lead to dangerous results, this is what I'm getting at. There is an inherent quality to cults that's going to be immoral in this respect, in that they are going to use people as a means toward their own agenda. And you can see that with some of the popular cults that we know of. Someone recently asked me the question, why do you think so many people drank the Kool-Aid at Jonestown, right? You guys know about Jim Jones and how almost 1,000 people committed suicide all at once because Jim Jones had convinced them to drink the cyanide in the Kool-Aid. And I explained to him, I said, well, this is what my lecture is about, that I was thinking about the slow walk. Notice what Jim Jones did. He didn't start with the Kool-Aid proposition. He wasn't like going to church one day and say, come on, everybody, we're all going to drink cyanide, right? He started with something that everyone accepted. So his idea was, you want to start, do you want to worship God and be good? And a whole bunch of people were like, yeah, let's worship God and be good. So we now get this large group of people. And then he's like, hey, do you guys want to share your money with the poor? And anyone who said no, he said, okay, you're out. And he closed the circle. He said, all right, you guys are going to help us. We're going to raise money for the poor. All right, now do you want to support culturally diverse people? Anyone who says no, you leave. And the rest of you, you tighten the circle. And then he says, all right, do you want to donate all of your money and join a commune? If you say no, then you leave. The rest of you, you're in my circle. We tighten the circle again. Do you want to move to South America with us? Now notice, this is the culling point, right? They're starting to cull the herd to say, if you're not willing to move with me to South America, then you're not a true believer. So that the followers are left with this choice. Do I want to give up this religion and stay in America, or am I going to follow this leader who I've trusted all this time and go to South America? So what do? They pack their bags, they go to South America. And then he asks the question, all right, do you want to avoid paying alimony and child support for your family? And they're like, okay, if you don't, then you're out. And if you do, we're tightening the circle. And then they get in trouble with the US, of course, they're breaking laws. And so a US senator shows up at the local airport outside of Jonestown, and he says to people, will you guys stop that US senator from coming into our compound? If you say no, you're out. If you say yes, I'm tightening the circle. And then he proposed, will you shoot that US senator? If you say no, you're out. If you say yes, you're in. You see how this got immoral fast, right? And then he says, all right, are you willing to drink cyanide in your Kool-Aid to end it all? How did they get to that point? I mean, it's dumbfounding to us because we haven't gone on that journey. We didn't take the slow walk. But those people were with Jim Jones for years, and that trust that they had built in him was going over a matter of time. He just kept escalating the stakes until people who didn't accept it would leave. Those who did stayed in, and that's how the cult works. Is they keep culling the herd until those that are left over are the true believers of that cult. And so by that point, they'll do anything, no matter how immoral. This is what Robert J. Lifton calls coercive persuasion. In his book on cults, he's saying that cults will manipulate people through coercion by simply walking them step by step down a road that leads to harsh consequences. So these are the 4 ingredients that I think make something a cult. By themselves, I don't think that they are inherently bad. I mean, let's face it, right? Blind faith is not bad in and of itself. It can be as innocent as a child's imagination, right? There's nothing wrong with that by itself. And us versus them can be used to separate bad people from good people. Think about child molesters and your children, right? You might want to separate those two and say, okay, us versus them. We need to make sure that we're keeping our children away from child molesters. That by itself is not a bad quality. The slow walk can be used in education to understand complex topics and to, break down certain big theories that are, like climate change or evolution or even understanding conspiracy theories. It takes a lot of work to understand those complex concepts. Slow walk can get you that. And the ends justify the means, well, That's never good, I would argue, but it might be necessary. I'm thinking of issues of warfare or killing in self-defense, where you may have to use someone as a means to an end to win that war. But I would never say that that is something that is good, and you can take an ethics class to hear my distinctions about that later on. But when you combine all four of those qualities together, you see the problem that happens here. When you combine all four of these, you get the ingredients for people to start doing some pretty bad things. If you were to drop out one of these qualities, notice that that prevents it from becoming a cult. If you take out the blind faith ingredient, well, then you have good evidence and good reasonings, right? Religions that have good reasons are the ones that tend to thrive. So you can see a lot of religions that are based on good reasons tend to be more successful because they're based on evidence and good reasoning. Blind faith is not necessary to that. You could get rid of that and have a legitimate religion. If you get rid of the us versus them mentality, then you get inclusivity. Religions that adopt this sort of inclusive behavior are more accepting of others and saying, look, everyone has value, everyone has meaning, therefore you can't just sort of like separate yourself as if like they're different and they're evil and we're good and never the two shall meet. Getting rid of the us versus them blocks the cult because cults don't tend to be inclusive. They tend to be exclusive and very exclusive at that. If you get rid of the ends justify the means, then you get good morality, right? Instead of using people as a means, instead of using people for exploitation, then you would have good ethics, and that could also be consistent with a legitimate religion. So that's why I think that all of those are necessary. Here are some of the ingredients that are not necessary for a cult, just to show you some examples of what I mean by this. When I was looking down my list, I started to realize that certain characteristics just are not necessary, like apocalyptic beliefs. Yes, a lot of cults do have apocalyptic beliefs. Heaven's Gate did, Jim Jones did, but Nexium did not. Nexium is a sex cult. They didn't have an end times prophecy or any type of belief about the end of the world coming, but yet they were still a cult. They convinced a bunch of people to be raped or sexually harassed because the cult leader wanted to have sex with them. That doesn't make it, that's not an ingredient that I see as necessary to being a cult. If they have a charismatic leader, a lot of people think that you have to have a charismatic leader to be a cult. There are cults that form from just simply a group that gets together and they encourage each other. No one of them has authority over the others, so it's not necessary. Sure, Jim Jones had that quality. Some young moon had that for the Moonies, but the Westboro Baptist Church did not. So you can see that there are cults that don't have that property. Love bombing is one that people have talked about, saying that when they sort of like, smother you with love and affection, and they're trying to get you to join them because they're wanting to, I don't know, maybe romantically get you involved in the cults. Sometimes this is just friendship bombing by, trying to smother people with love as a way of trying to make them feel welcome or make them feel loved. Nexium did that and the Moonies did that, but the Westboro Baptist Church did not. So that's not necessarily a necessary condition. Fear and intimidation tactics. The Boston Church of Christ did that. ISIS did that. But Heaven's Gate did not. So it's not a necessary condition. Financial exploitation, where they ask you to donate all of your possessions or become financially dependent on them. Scientology does that. The multi-level marketing schemes do that. But the Black Hebrew movement does not. Right? Multi-level marketing schemes are cults in the sense that they are exploiting people by trying to get you to buy into whatever it is that they're selling. I remember when my sister got involved in Amway, and she was like, you need just to buy all this stuff from Amway. It's a better product than the stuff that's in the supermarkets. And I tried some of it. They gave it to me for free because I wasn't going to buy it unless I knew what it was. And it was terrible. The food was terrible. The toothpaste was terrible. It was cheap stuff. And of course, it wasn't making a lot of money. So think about how that works as a cult, Hey, do you like buying products? Would you like to buy my products? Would you like to make a little money? Would you like to sell my products? Would you like to recruit 5 to 10 other people to sell my products? Would you tell those people to recruit 5 to 10 people to sell my products? You see how that starts to build toward, you're just using the people to make more money so that you can be at the top of the pyramid, and that exploits the poor, right? Multi-level marketing, or pyramid schemes as they used to be called, are simply exploiting the poor by using all the money from the bottom of the pyramid up to the top to the people who are already rich to begin with, right? I mean, the pyramid is already formed by the time you get in it. The reason why multi-level marketing schemes don't work is that you can only go through that generation of recruiting 5 more people to join it. You can only do that 10 or 11 times before you've exhausted every human being on planet Earth. So if you're number 9 or number 10, who's left to pick up the tab when you're trying to sell this product to someone else? No one. That's why it exploits the poor, right? And that's where that's usually when you start finding out about the pyramid scheme, but it's too late by that point. So you can see that financial exploitation is common in religions like Scientology or MLMs, but the Nation of Islam does not have that property. So therefore, they wouldn't fit this either. Sexual exploitation. I used to say that this is like a big red flag in cults because you can usually identify a cult if they're demanding that you have sex with the founder. But that's not true for all religions. David Koresh did it, Nexium did it, but Scientology did not. So you can see that there are religions that don't have that property, so I don't see it as necessary. And then aggressive recruiting techniques. Scientology does that, the Moonies did that, but David Koresh did not. He was not trying to seek out converts all the time. So you can see that none of these characteristics are found in every cult, but they're just sort of like they're secondary properties of a cult. But the 4 that I found are definitely in a cult, and those are the ones that I think lead to this behavior of people starting to justify these horrific, immoral acts through their practice. So let's talk about blind faith for a second in a little more depth. One quality about blind faith, notice this fits some of the criteria that I had on my previous list, is having an infallible leader. It doesn't have to have that, it's not necessary, but it's part of the blind faith. If the leader says, I can't be wrong, then that's an indication that they're on that path of just saying, you just have to believe whatever I say, right? To be human is to err. Isn't it the same? So why would you ever say that a person, a human being, doesn't make mistakes? Of course they do. We all make mistakes. We are all finite people. We are all limited persons. And if they lack accountability, then that also becomes a problem, right? This is where they're trying to evade any type of checks and balances. So if the leader doesn't have anyone to sort of watch out for them, have maybe a board of directors, or even just having public access so that people know what you're teaching, that accountability holds people accountable. No one is above reproach. No one is above reproach. You should be able to question that of any leader, any pastor, any imam, any rabbi. The ability to question them is what helps us to understand who they really are and prevents people from hiding things from us. They also will tend to suppress critical thinking skills. So this is another form of blind faith if they tell you don't ask questions, or if they just say, accept what I say without question. That's a big red flag to me, because of course I have questions. I want to know why you believe that. I want to know where you got this information. I want to know how you came to this conclusion. When they suppress your critical thinking skills, they are treating you like a child. And when you are of adult age and have rational capacities, I would imagine that you should be able to search for the truth on your own. And whenever they suppress doubts, right? If they're asking you to not ask questions, that is a red flag that would indicate that they're about to pull something over on you. Now, by itself, that's not necessarily a quality of a cult. That is, religions can have this. The thing that I want to point out, though, is that the phrase blind faith does not appear in any scripture in any religion. And yet people think that that's what religion is. It's all about blind faith. Oddly enough, when you study religion worldwide, you notice that America is very unique in that we are one of the few nations that teaches blind faith. Again, when you look at religions across the seas, when you go across the ocean, when you go to other countries, religions don't use that phrase because it's not in any scriptures. But cult leaders love it. So again, you can have a religion function with blind faith. As long as it doesn't have these other characteristics, it might be okay. It can get a free pass. But when you combine the blind faith with the other 3, it starts working its way toward disaster. So then we get to the us versus them mentality. The first example of a us versus them mentality is a purity test. Are you good enough? So they're wanting to check to see. A lot of cults will start to become very legalistic because it's a contest, right? If you have two people in your circle and one of them, they disagree on what they think is right or wrong, who do you think is going to win that argument in a religion? The most legalistic one. They're going to impose their standard onto the others, saying that the others are backsliders or they're not good, or worse, that you are one of them. They exclude you, they'll kick you out. And notice how a lot of cults will kick people out and isolate them, saying you can't speak to those former members anymore because they want to control who they're talking to. When I was in Ball State University, we went to a hypnotist for fun. They had, the college had entertainment for the night, and we went to a hypnotist. And I remember he got a bunch of people from the audience to all go on stage, and they were all going to be hypnotized. And I forget exactly how he led up to this, but he got to the point where he was going to hypnotize them, and he says, I'm going to put you all asleep. And he did this weird whooshing noise. He goes, and they all fell down, right? He says, you're all about to fall asleep. And he goes, and he just does that. Well, half the line of chairs didn't fall down. The others were all leaning on top of each other, but the other half were still awake. So he did it again. He goes, and some more of them fell down. And he did it again. And there were still a couple of people that didn't fall down. And he did it again until there was this one guy who just would not lay down. And he's looking around going, what's going on? And what did the hypnotist do? He picked him up from his chair and sent him off the stage. That was a culling that just happened. And I was thinking about that example when I wrote this lecture, because what he was doing is seeing who's willing to play along with my hypnotist routine. That's what he was doing. He wanted to see who would fall for it, who's going to play along. And then he would get them to do all these sorts of absurd things. Once they bought in, he would do the slow walk. And then he started getting people to do ridiculous things on stage because they were slowly moving toward the place where, hey, I've already fallen asleep and pretended I was asleep on my chair. I might as well keep going with this. And they did, and they kept going with it. Anyone who didn't, he would say just woke up, and then he would send them off the stage. That's how cults work. So you can see how this us versus them creates a sort of a purity test to try to exclude people who they don't like. If you're not in agreement with me, then I'm going to shove you out, and now you're part of the them qualities, right? You are outside of my circle. So cults tend to be very exclusivistic. And they also practice isolation techniques, as I indicated before. If you leave a cult, they will oftentimes not speak with you. They will not allow, family members that aren't in your cult to talk to you. They're very exclusivistic. They're trying to isolate you so that you don't associate with people outside of the religion. That way they can control you better. And they also practice some form of attribution fallacy, where they're trying to say that everyone else is bad and only our group is good. So when something happens, that let's say you get caught doing something bad, like let's say there's a sex scandal or whatever, they'll make excuses and say, well, it's okay that the sexual harassment case was okay because God ordained it, right? And then if you don't accept that, then you're shoved out. But if you accept it and you're like, well, okay, maybe God did accept this sexual harassment case. And then the true believers stay in. This sort of test to see, are you with me or not, helps them to separate the true believers of the cult to the non-believers. And anyone who's then outside of the cult becomes the bad guy. They become the villains. And I would question whether or not that is appropriate, because this is a form of confirmation bias, isn't it? You're only showing the good things of your in-group. You're only looking at the bad qualities of everyone else, but you're ignoring the bad qualities of the group, and you're ignoring the good qualities of everyone else. I mean, doesn't every person have good and bad qualities? So how can you say that those people are entirely bad and these people are entirely good? Everyone has good and bad qualities. And when you start to divide people into those two categories, you start making a division that is lining up for the slow walk. And that's where we get to the slow walk. This is what a lot of people will call brainwashing, where you're moving a person inch by inch toward a new belief or a new behavior. And that slow walk happens usually over the course of months, if not years. The longer you're in the cult, the more of a true believer you are. If you've ever studied Heaven's Gate, right? They don't come out right away with the UFO stuff. They start by just saying, hey, we can help you kind of build your own self-esteem. We can help you work on your psychological problems. And then they keep building and building until they get to the UFO part. And they're like, oh yeah, Jesus is riding on a UFO behind Halley-Bopp Comet. Come join us. We're all going to commit suicide, right? It's a slow walk. It doesn't happen all at once. So they're just inching you inch by inch for over the course of months or years toward this absurd behavior. And they like to use information control as an example of that, because if they can control what who you're talking to, or what uh, media you're listening to, or what books you're reading, that will prevent them from losing this hold over you. They want you controlled, so they want to make sure that you are only listening to their voice. They're only listening to their version of religions. This is also connected to the continuum fallacy. For those of you in my logic class, you've probably heard me call this the heap fallacy. The heap fallacy is a fallacy when you say, by piling up sand onto a table, you never get a heap, right? So if I put one piece of sand on a table, is that a heap? Most of us would say no. If I put two pieces of sand on the table, is that a heap? Right? You'd still say no, right? If I keep adding sand to the pile, doesn't it eventually become a heap? But what people tend to say is, no, it never became a heap, because just adding one grain of sand doesn't turn it into a heap. It's obviously a very slow transition. And that's what the slow walk is doing. They don't start with the heap. They start with the individual pieces of sand, right? So you'd be willing to eat a piece of sand, right? You probably have done that if you've ever been to the beach, or if you've ever eaten food that wasn't processed well. You probably have eaten dirt, right? I'm sorry to say this, but you've probably eaten rat poop. Sorry, but you have, right? But if I gave you a plate full of rat poop, you probably won't eat it, right? So it's that slow walk of working you toward that. And the fallacy kicks in when you say that there is no transition to the heap, or the continuum doesn't lead to the immoral behavior. If you're buying in whatever the cult leader says, you're willing to walk with them even to death. That is, many cults will end up in suicide results, or killing others, for example. And I think one of the best examples of this continuum fallacy is the Stanley Milgram experiment from 1963. Many of you probably have heard of this before. It was an experiment to test people to see how willing they were to obey an authority figure when it led to something immoral, like giving someone electrocution. So the idea was that they would have the person holding a machine with a dial on it that had voltage numbers on it, and they say, we want you to turn up the dial, and the person on the other side of the wall is going to be shocked by the electricity that you're giving to them, and we're just going to do a test for this, right? So the person, usually wearing a lab coat, would be standing there and saying, look, go ahead and turn it up to 1 or 2 or 5 or 10, and they keep increasing the voltage, and the person on the other side of the wall eventually starts screaming because they're getting shocked, and then eventually they may even fall over, and you hear a big thud on the other side of the wall. And then the lab guy, the scientist, would say, all right, keep turning it up, right? The people in that, it was over 50%, I think it was closer to like 60% of the people who were in that experiment kept turning the dial up because they just trusted the person in the lab coat to know what they were doing. And so this is, I think, a good example of the slow walk fallacy, where people are simply walking you to a place where you are doing something that sounds immoral, right? They don't see the person fall over. They don't know if they're electrocuted, but it sounds to them that the person has been electrocuted, and yet they just keep turning up the dial. Why would we do that? We wouldn't start with that. Like if I hooked you up to a battery and said, would you put your tongue on this, right? Most of us would be like, no, excuse me, I'm not going to do that if it's a high voltage battery, right? But if you slowly work a person to that, would you fall for it? I mean, mind you, 30 to 40% of people did walk away from that experiment. So some people are smart enough to eventually stop that and say, I don't want to do it. But why are 60% falling for this? So that was the Milgram experiment. And then the ends justify the means is a form of financial exploitation, right? When you're asking people to give up all of their money so that you can be dependent upon the cult for existence, they will exploit you to no end, saying, now if you leave empty-handed. So we've got you, right? It's their way of trying to use you by taking all your money, using it for themselves, whereas if you leave penniless. So that's a form of exploitation. It's using people as a means to an end. Or sexual exploitation, right? When they demand that you have sex with the founder, that should be the most obvious red flag. So why are so many people joining Nexium? Why are so many people joining David Koresh's cult, right? He demanded that every male in that church give their wives up so that he could have sex with them. Ask yourself, right, whether or not you would fall for that, right? Hey, you want to come worship with us? Hey, you want to come to our weekly Bible study? Hey, you want to accept me as your prophet? Oh, would you accept me as an incarnation of Jesus Christ? Oh, are you willing to give up sex with your spouses to live a holier life? Okay, will you give me your wife so that I can bear the burden of having sex with her? Right? If somebody started with that last point, I think I would laugh at them and then I'd probably punch them, right? And then, yeah, I guess I'd walk away. I wouldn't accept that, right? Obviously we're going to have this reaction to that. But why did so many people in the Waco, Texas, fall for that? This is obviously not a godly man. This is a horny dude, right? Who's trying to manipulate people by having sex with everyone else's partner. And then, of course, examples of terrorism. Once you get to the level where you are treating people as a means to an end and you don't care about them personally, you are willing to use people for acts of severe violence. As many of you probably have seen before, Lord Acton once made the quote that power tends to corrupt, but absolute power corrupts absolutely. Lord Acton made that statement when the Pope declared himself to be infallible in 1870. He said it about 17 years later. And right after the Pope declared himself to be infallible, he then decided that he had the power to forgive acts of regicide, meaning if you kill a king, the Pope can forgive you and absolve you of that sin. Imagine the power that that wielded. And so Lord Acton made this quote to say, look, as soon as you give someone absolute power, they're going to use that for ends justify the means mentality. And if you think that this is all just simply a bunch of make-believe, here are some real-life examples of that Milgram experiment that don't necessarily have to do with religions, but these are examples of how people fell for extreme acts of violence. The Nazi Germany phenomenon. Why did the Germans allow the execution of the Jews? The Rwandan genocide, the Jonestown massacre, the Chernobyl disaster, the Iraq war with the Abu Ghraib prison abuse. How did they get to the point where they were raping the prisoners? What was going through their mind? It didn't start with that. Hey, join the military. You get to rape prisoners. That's not how it was done. It was a slow walk to that destination. And then the financial crisis of 2008. Do you remember when the world's economy almost collapsed? This isn't child's play. That each and every one of us have to be thinking about whether or not we are falling for these things, because hundreds, if not thousands of people are joining cults every year and giving them money and allowing themselves to be sexually harassed or exploited or resort to some type of extreme violence. Think about it. The world's economy almost collapsed because of this. Now, not everyone in a cult is brainwashed. This would explain why. If they're using the slow walk, they're taking each one of their followers and walking them when those that accept, will continue to be kind of maybe raised up in authority. Scientology does that by saying, look, do you want a free stress test? Would you like relief from your anxieties and worries and fears? Would you like to meet with me once a week in a closed session? Would you mind taking a few training routines for the low, low price of $150? Would you mind doing these training routines on a daily basis? Would you like to raise your status within the Church of Scientology? Would you mind paying us thousands of dollars to keep raising that status in the church? Would you like to become an operating Thetan? Would you mind if we told you that all of us are aliens trapped in human vessels enslaved here by the galactic Lord Xenu 95 million years ago in a galactic civil war? Right? You don't start with the aliens. You build toward that, and Scientology is trying to get people to work their way up to that. So not everyone is brainwashed. A lot of people are still of their rational minds thinking, wow, this sounds like a good idea. Yes, I do want to end my stress. I'd like to end my anxiety. I'd like to try your training routines. And then when they get into it, they keep walking you closer and closer to that next level. So how do you avoid a cult? Well, one step is simply self-reflection. Learn how your brain works. Take a psychology class, right? Learn what your personal biases are. You have them, you may not know what they are. Once you know who you are, right? The famous dictum that Socrates made famous, know thyself, nosce te ipsum, means that you need to know who you are and understand how your brain works so that you don't fall prey to this. What are your weaknesses? What are your touching points? You have to know that about yourself to prevent yourself from falling into these cults. Second, ask questions. The minute they tell you to stop asking questions, that should be a red flag for you to leave. If they don't know the answer to your questions, then don't have a foundation to that religion. And if they're unwilling to tell you the answer to your question, then they're hiding something. But either way, that's not a good religion. So avoid that. Ask questions. Learn how to search for the truth. Take a philosophy class. It's what we do. It's what philosophy is all about, searching for truth. It helps you to avoid the blind faith component, right? You want to understand, well, tell me, what is this religion really about? What is this political movement all about? What is this multi-level marketing scheme really about? Investigate it for yourself. Ask questions. I don't think that doubting is a sin. Poor doubting Thomas gets a bad rap. That's not a term that's used in scriptures, but the word faith does not mean believe whatever you want. No religion teaches that. Right? Faith does not mean believing things when there is counter evidence out there. That's not what religions teach. Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism all demand good reasoning. They demand it in their scriptures. So don't just fall for that. Ask questions, find out what the reasons are. Then apply a reality check. See what's true and what's false. Learn how to verify what is true. Take a science class, right? The whole process of the scientific method is to test claims to see whether they hold up under scrutiny. Educate yourself. Don't just believe whatever you hear. Learn about the truth. Go look at the evidence. Do a Google search. Ask scholars about what they think. Look at different points of view. Learn about different moral theories. Take an ethics class. That will avoid the ends justify the means mentality. And then listen to the critics or the former believers. One of the nice things about social media right now is that there are a lot of people who are leaving cults and they're going onto YouTube and sharing their stories. I've been watching a lot of them because I'm very curious about this. I want to see, well, not only do I want to know what that cult taught, but I also want to see how they fell for it and how they got out. And so if you listen to the critics, if you listen to the former believers, then you're getting another side of the story. This helps you to see both sides of the story. If you're only hearing one side, you don't know whether that's true or false. But when you hear both sides of the story, you can start to see the objective truth. It helps us to remove that confirmation bias we were talking about earlier. And so you need to look for disconcerting information that might help you to understand what's true and what's false. This will help you to avoid the us versus them mentality, because it turns out you are a lot like them. And they're not that different from you. And when you get to know those quote unquote enemies, you start to realize, wait a minute, they think just like us. I remember when I was in college, I always investigated cults when I was in college. It was a pastime. Anyways, I would talk to these cult people, and they started asking me questions about what I believed. And we started talking to each other, and we realized we actually shared a lot of things in common with each other. I mean, good stuff that was stuff we had in common. And they were surprised by that. They were like, wow, I thought you were some kind of weird satanic pedophile. I'm like, where did you get that idea? Like, well, that's what our leaders taught us. Don't associate with him, right? He's a Satanist or something like that. So look for disconfirming evidence, and that will help you to remove the confirmation bias. Now, of course, some people may find out that you're already in a cult. So let me give you some suggestions from Rick Allen Ross, who spends his life helping people to deprogram from cults. He says that the first thing you need to do to get someone out of a cult is to define what those characteristics of a cult are. You need to know what those characteristics are to be able to identify whether or not you're in a cult. So when I say I teach this as my last lecture in world religions or religion in America, I tell them this is the most important lecture of the semester because I want each and every one of you to be able to identify a cult when you see it. If you don't know what the characteristics of a cult are, you're more likely to join one. So educate yourself. Read books on cults. Learn what they're saying. Second, he says, discuss techniques used to influence their members. So there are all sorts of techniques that people use, like the slow walk fallacy, the one I'm trying to highlight here, to say that when you learn those techniques, you can then see it when it's happening. You'll spot it and say, oh, wait, I just realized what you're doing to me, right? My sister has joined every pyramid scheme that has ever been offered in America. And every time she does it, I quickly realize what she's doing. I now, because the pattern, right? I'm seeing the pattern. But when she first started, I was like, really? Is that true? Right? Are we really going to make millions of dollars on this? She's like, oh yeah, Amway, it's the best. And so, that's when I tried it and it was terrible. But, you start to notice what methods they're using to convince people. Identify the history of the group and its leader. Once you see who's leading this group and you start to realize that they're not good people, that they have this background, then you start to say, well, wait a minute, this is maybe not the group I want to be associated with. Sure, leaders are going to have bad qualities too. I get that. No one's perfect. But if they have a history of, let's say, physical abuse or sexual harassment or financial exploitation, then these should be warning signs. And if you can get a person who's in a cult to recognize not just the techniques that they're using, but to point out what the history of this group is, where did they come from? How did they get to this point? That's why I mentioned the Boston Church of Christ, because they were one of the groups that I met at NIU. And as far as I know, they're still there. They were kicked off campus because enough people were physically harassed by them to get them kicked off campus. But I was talking to them and I learned about their history all the way back to Boston. They changed their name every time they moved. So they changed their name to the Chicago Church of Christ, then the DeKalb Church of Christ. And when they got kicked off campus, they came back as another organization. I'm like, you guys are still teaching the same thing. They're like, no, we changed our name. We're a different organization now. I'm like, but you're saying the same things. Right? So you got to recognize their history, their leaders. And then you need to evaluate concerns and the potential harm that comes from this. When you start to realize that this slow walk can lead someone down a path to becoming immoral and doing terrible things, that helps you to start noticing the signs all along the way. This is what Benjamin Zablocki called the exit cost analysis, where you're having to sort of judge, is it worth it for me to leave? What will I gain from leaving? And what do I have to unlearn? When I watch these YouTube people who are leaving cults and talking, they frequently admit that they still carry some of the cult's beliefs with them. And they're like trying to figure out, well, wait a minute, was that a true belief or was it false? Because it's still embedded. They've been brainwashed into it, so it's still embedded into their psychology. So learning to see these signposts will help you to know what is a cult and what isn't. Here are just a few of the characteristics of a cult leader. When they claim to be infallible and say they can do no wrong, they claim to be omniscient as if they know everything. Oh, and you don't. And they claim to have supernatural powers and can do impossible things, but they never show you that evidence. They claim to be divisive and create an us versus them mentality, or they exaggerate claims and demonize others. They catastrophize by creating a doomsday scenario, or they fearmonger, trying to poison people's insecurities and worries to prey upon others, or they end up becoming legalistic, demanding perfection among their members. Those are characteristics of a cult leader. So one cult leader once made this claim. Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh said, the good disciple follows what the master says. The good disciple doesn't think. I'm leaving, right? If I heard someone say that, I would stand up and walk out the door, right? Because that is opening the door for a cult. So here are some characteristics of a non-cult leader. The recognition of our faults. I'm not perfect. Recognition of our limitations. Knowing that we have limited knowledge or abilities. Inclusivity, seeking cooperation and respecting others. Avoiding demonization, seeing the good in everyone. Being truth-centered, using logic and reasoning. Reality checking, meaning it's evidence-based. Compassion and forgiveness. These are the signs of a good leader. And I think you can start to see the difference once you learn that pattern. And I think you then would be able to understand what makes something a cult and what makes something not a cult. Oops, sorry, I just erased it. Anyways, can you go back to the second to last slide? So in conclusion, I just want to say that a cult is a group that practices manipulation or thought control using misguided or coercive means toward the potential for harm. When you have all four of those ingredients, you're going to get that effect. The potential for harm will be manifest by them simply walking you toward that. So now that you know this, let's share this information with others. Let's try to help people avoid joining those cults, whether they're religious cults or secular cults, so that they're not going to get exploited. Thank you very much for coming.